Good evening. This is, if you are one of these people who's online on YouTube, this is the parish hall at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Petersburg. And this is no longer my first forum hour. I did this last year during Lent, and I was so nervous because none of these people know who I am. And I don't know if they're going to like the way that I talk about the Bible, but many of you came back the following year. So it's fine. I'm much less nervous now. I have notes in front of you. You can email me or the church if you want those notes and you're looking online. This is probably the last time I'm going to talk to the camera though, because all of them came and are in the room with me. So that's the last time I'm talking to the camera. Last year we did the study of the Torah, the 5 first books of the Bible. And just about every conversation began with me saying, we got to go back to the beginning. And I will do a version of that. But I want to first tell y'all, I'm going to barrel through the structure of, in this case tonight, Daniel and Ezekiel, 2 of the prophets who are writing from exile. And I'm going to try and build a case over the next 4 weeks that the prophets and the tenor and what they're interested in and what they're talking about are different based on chronology and their circumstance. Say different stuff about, hope different stuff about the world because of where they are. And the 5th week, if you looked at our announcements, read our emails, saw the bells, is just Jonah. Because Jonah's got everything. I'm not going to tell you for 5 weeks what I mean by that, but I mean everything. So I'm working towards that. I am totally interruptible. I am able to answer questions. I was for many, many years a children and youth minister. So if I say something and you're like, that doesn't make any sense, you can stop me and I'll say something about it. But I'm going to try desperately hard in the next 20 minutes to get through Daniel and give everybody a break. Get coffee or something, and then do 20 minutes and get through Ezekiel, and then do another break so that anybody who wants to leave can get out of here without feeling guilty. And anybody who wants to talk about any of these things can just, I've got all night. We got a sitter at home. It's fine. Mary Margaret's program ends at the same time, but she's got to commute in. So that's the shape of what I'm going to do. Questions, comments at the outset. You have notes in front of you. Those are a little bit because I might go off the rails and you still deserve to know stuff if I do. If you're the kind of person who learns by reading stuff and you're following along and I say something the opposite of what my notes say, you should interrupt me and call me out because I really wrote all these notes thinking that they were what I was going to tell people. But I'm going to give away the whole 5 weeks all at once. And you can extrapolate everything that I'm going to say for the rest of the season, including anytime I'm talking about one of the books of the prophets from the pulpit. This isn't just Lent. You have possibly heard me say some version of this before. In modern English, prophecy means prediction. People talk about prophets like they looked at the future and they knew what was going to happen, like Babe Ruth calling his hit. And that is almost never what the Bible means. It's almost never what the Bible's version of a prophet might be more like a poet if we were translating it and trying and knew what the word prophecy would become in English. Prophecies aren't fulfilled because they're future looking and then they happen. Prophecies are fulfilled because the Hebrew God, the God written about in Hebrew, the language is literally designed. It doesn't have past, present, or future tense. The people writing the Bible are trying to make the point over and over again that God is timeless. And so when you're reading in English that God's going to do something in the future, That's a translation where they had to make a choice because English doesn't, we don't have the ability to speak without time. We don't have the ability to describe something like that. But it is a choice that we make, that our translators make in English. The people writing the Bible are like, hey, when God does something, it happens from the beginning of time to the end simultaneously. God saves you in baptism. And what that means from the church's perspective, from the Bible's perspective, is that God has always already done that and is doing it right now and will continue doing it. And we're just like these people who happen to live in a universe that has linear time. And so we don't experience that as all at once, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't. Prophets, I think the analogy that I use here is like biblical prophecy might be like telling a pregnant woman that she is going to love her child. On one hand, that's a little prediction-y. Like, it hadn't happened yet. On the other hand, we all know for a bunch of other reasons that is actually how it unfolds in all of the healthy systems. Mothers love their children. On the third hand, even if you have been a mother, you kind of know that the person you're talking to knows more about the love they have for that child than you ever will, because it's deeply contextual. The prophets speak with God's voice right now. And starting with Daniel and Ezekiel, and I'm going to stop droning on about this point here in a second. Starting with Daniel and Ezekiel, they're both people who had stuff that they said were going to happen that then happened by the time somebody wrote it down. And we have all this evidence that people didn't keep these scriptures because they're like, look, see, Daniel was right because the thing happened. They're like, look, see, Daniel is right because the thing that they prophesied continues to describe the world that we live in. We read Jesus fulfilled the scriptures. And it doesn't mean that the Jewish Bible is constructed with all these fortune-telling moments and Jesus checked off all the boxes. Jesus fulfilled these scriptures in the sense that all of the people who are making prophecies in the Old Testament are describing a way God interacts with, loves, is trying to bring about peace in the world. And those things are all evident in the life of Jesus. Sometimes, given version of accidentally. Sometimes, when we talk about the Mount of Olives, he definitely meant to be saying hey, I'm like this prophecy. That's why you'd go hang out on the Mount of Olives if you're trying to make the point that you're the Son of Man. In order to study, I swear I'm getting to Daniel. I got 12 seconds left. In order to study anything in the Old Testament, I always bring people back to the first 11 chapters of Genesis because it's almost the last thing written of the Old Testament. They already had the story that we're going to read in Daniel. They already had the story that they're going to read in Ezekiel. They'd already returned from the exile and had been conquered again. And they're now living with the powers of Alexander the Great and the Greeks and the Romans under Pompey. The people who wrote the beginning of Genesis were writing what's the thing that's going to tie all of these other pieces together. Fun fact, I said it last year, you don't have to remember, this is not a pop quiz, but I am curious. Does anybody know the oldest story in the Bible? Come. Guess.
My brain is just searching.
That's all right. Job, you're coming up with a religion. You've met God. You're thinking about like this new relationship you have with the God in the universe. The first question somebody's going to ask you if you tell them about this new God business you're in is, okay, why do bad things happen to good people? Like, Job makes sense as an oldest Hebrew scripture, because why do bad things happen to good people is a very important starting with question. All of y'all could have made it through your entire day without wondering about the beginning of the universe. In the beginning is a very late development in any religion, because there's a lot of questions you got to get to first to see if anybody wants to hear what this religion has to say. And those first 11 chapters of Genesis, those things that they wrote to tie together all of the rest of what came next, begins with a story of royalty. Adam and Eve described as kings and monarchs. Both Ezekiel and Daniel are going to describe a throne that's empty. That throne is, and they're both going to use the phrase for the Son of Man. This idea that creation is meant to be a place where humans and God rule together. And we have abdicated that responsibility by saying, like, no, we don't want partnership. We're going to decide for ourselves, because I got a better idea what's good and evil than you do. So instead of this partnership, I think I can just do it all on my own. And so we abandon that partnership, and there is plenty of ways to read scripture that are not this. But one of the major narrative threads that ties all of these books together is like, how do we get back into the garden? How do we get back into the partnership? How do we get back into the role that we were meant to have? And Christians are going to say, like, well, Jesus, we're going to be a part of him because he could do it, because he was this Son of Man character. I mean, like, really, you go on TikTok right now, it would not take you long to find a video of somebody saying, like, Jesus never claimed to be divine. He absolutely did, and that's why they murdered him. Just because you weren't familiar with the symbol doesn't mean he wasn't saying it. Let's talk about the shape of Daniel. Have I thoroughly confused anybody yet? Y'all are just willing to believe me. I promise if you go look up this Garden of Eden thing, it's true. The book of Daniel, you could easily divide into two sections. Chapters 1 through 6 are like stories about Daniel and his friends, and chapters 7 through 12 are like stories about Daniel's dream. And I don't need to drink fast, because fast is not going to help me actually speak faster, because I'll choke. You could divide it that way, and if you divided it that way, it would make sense. In English, here's a bunch of buddies. This is Daniel. The siege of Jerusalem is about 5 years afterwards. This is year like 587-ish BC. The Jerusalem has not yet fallen, but people have started to be carted away, including Daniel and his buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are not names we considered for our child. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all four of them are part of the royal line. So, like, Jerusalem has not yet fallen, but the Babylonians have been carting away people who might be king. Like, David's family is not done, but they are no longer at risk. They're in cities way far away. They've been carted off into exile. They are held captive in the courts of Babylon. And so you could say, like, here's the division, here's the things that they got up to, and here's the dream that Daniel has. That's where a lot of the book of Revelation comes from, is these same, like, images. But that is because we're reading it in English. I want to say Hebrew. It's not in Hebrew. Chapters 1 and 8 through 12 are in Hebrew. They stop in the middle, and chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke. I mean, it uses the same letters. It's like Michael, you're the only person in this room who I remember speaks another language. I know some of y'all speak other languages. I'm using him as an example because I don't remember. You could do this. You could read in English and like switch over and be like, here's the Spanish now. And you would know, like, this is a different language. This is clearly this is a different section of text. So that background is chapter 1. Like, how did these guys get in this situation? And chapters 2 and 7 mirror each other. They're the same sort of story. Chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and the dream is of a statue made of multiple kinds of materials. And it is clear to Daniel, although not clear to the court of Nebuchadnezzar, that the multiple kinds of materials are these different kingdoms that have slowly overtaken the portion of the Middle East that we are accustomed to studying and talking about. And in the dream, a comet comes and smashes down into destroying that sculpture, destroying the thing that's supposed to represent all these other kingdoms. And that stone, that comet becomes a mountain. And we should be drawn back to that Garden of Eden space, because the garden is a mountain, and Sinai is this like mountain, and Jesus is always like bringing people up the mountain. There's a single image of mountains as spaces where earth is trying to reach up toward heaven, where there's a sort of intermingling of God's power. And we continue to have very few cities in the world where people are like actually up on the top of mountains. It's much easier to build down in the valleys and like look up. Chapters 3 and 6 are also paired. Chapter 6 is the only story most people can tell you about Daniel. He did something, got thrown into a lion's den. I don't know what he did, but he got thrown into a lion's den and then he didn't. I've seen the Veggie Tale. That's what I feel like most people could tell you. Thank you. If y'all haven't seen the Veggie Tale, it's excellent. Daniel refuses to worship Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar's like, well, my hands are tied. I guess I have to have you killed because you won't worship me. And that's a law that I made that you have to. And I can't just go around undoing laws. Earlier in chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had refused to eat the food that had been sacrificed to the Babylonian gods. And so they were thrown into a furnace and were not burned. Daniel's thrown into this lion's den and was not consumed. These are stories written by and to people in exile who are living in a plural world, and they're looking around at polytheistic pagan cultures. They're looking around at people who primarily don't understand. I mean, I'm doing some of my notes out of order here. It is confusing to everybody for about 800 years that Jewish people won't just stop being Jewish. Everyone else stops being the thing that they were if they get conquered. That's the rules. The Romans had to write laws to excuse Jewish people from worshiping Roman gods because they just didn't understand what was wrong with these weirdos. They just continued to believe in their God, yea, though we conquered them with our better military. And then they came up to us and told us, like, yeah, our God was actually punishing us for not believing hard enough with your army. That's weird. That is a huge development in religious thought in the world. And it took almost 1,000 years for humanity to like catch up with the idea that maybe the Jewish people are going to continue being Jewish no matter what we try to do to them. is a very strange concept. And so the Babylonians don't understand. What do you mean you're still Jewish? We moved you. We brought you to a different place. Our army won. And now we've made this feast. We have these things that we've burned for whatever I'm just not remembering the name of the Babylonian god at this point, because it changes over the course of the Babylonian Empire. It's I don't understand why you aren't eating these things that should celebrate how we are all on the same side of the clearly strongest God now. People are living in that world where not everybody, nobody understands what they're doing. Nobody understands what they're going through. Nobody understands what they want out of a relationship with the universe. There's a totally different concept of religion than existed anywhere else in the world. And we all now live in a world where people pretty much keep their religion. I mean, if Virginia was conquered by a Hindu nation, I would not suddenly become Hindu. That's not high up on the list of risks at the moment. But if, in the thought experiment, I wouldn't be well, Episcopalianism didn't work out because I've been conquered. Everybody's like this now. Nobody's like this then. And so they were inventing not just a way to survive, they actually invented the way that all religions now survive. By saying what happens to me is not actually going to be tied to whether or not I believe this. And we all live in a world now where not everybody is Christian. Certainly not everybody's Episcopalian. There's 2 million of us. There's 8 billion people. When I meet somebody, I gotta assume they don't know what I am. It's wait, you're dressed like a priest. How come you have a wedding ring? It's the Orthodox also have wedding rings. Don't look at me like that. There's 300 million of them. This project of who the people are writing to and what they're trying to communicate is here in 3 and 6. I got 2 minutes. I can get through the rest of Daniel. I'm going to stretch that 20-minute thing a little bit. The second project is here in the very middle, the very center of the story. Chapters 4 and 5 parallel each other, and they're right next to each other. They are Nebuchadnezzar and his son. And both of them are corrupt, evil monsters. They behave so terribly, and Nebuchadnezzar's, the way the story is told in the book of Daniel, it's as though he actually becomes some sort of beast, some sort of wild animal. I can't think of it as anything other than a werewolf. Werewolves are not a part of Jewish mysticism. But I think of Nebuchadnezzar as this werewolf wandering around, prowling, attacking his own soldiers. And he's able to humble himself and to express repentance and to try to be a morally better person. And so he's turned back into a person. Because you're out here in exile, and yeah, the way these people who just conquered you and killed your family and dragged you off into exile exercise power is morally wrong, and God will deal with them in the fullness of time. But there are people who are using power in ways that are not okay, who are also able to be decent people, who are able to express humility, who are able to be reasonable. I mean, whoever you are going to vote for president, that person is going to wield power in a very complicated system with the greatest military in the history of the world. And I bet you don't personally approve of everything that will happen over that 4-year term. But that man can be good or bad. That person can be good or bad, can exercise the authority that they have even in the systems that aren't morally unimpeachable, and can be decent, and can be trying to pull somebody toward decency. Belshazzar is the Babylonian name for Daniel. Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's son, and he isn't able to do it at all. He's just this corrupt, slimy murder person. This is a phrase, the writing on the wall, like the hand of God appears to him and warns him by etching warnings into the wall to like stop your evil stuff. And he doesn't, and he's just stabbed for it. Because you can also wield power in a way that leads to death. The end is Daniel's dream, and we're back in Hebrew. There's all these things that we now look at in the book of Revelation and like, I don't know what this says. I don't know why these weird beasties are here. Well, the weird beasties are from Daniel. And they got strange heads, and they got strange amalgamations of form. And so, like, why does that lion have lizard feet? And, like, why does that boar have wings? And why does that goat have a whole bunch of horns? And I don't know. Unless the purpose is the inhumanity, the beastliness of rule by force. The beastliness of we have made our king a god, because right and wrong has to do with whether or not you're Babylonian. It doesn't have to do with anything that transcends this moment in time. And that message is also one we care about in the 21st century. Because we continue to live in a world where there are people who, like, well, it's right because it was good for me. And that's not what makes something right. It is my constant belief, my contention, that each of you already carries a lot of the philosophy that I'm talking about in Daniel with you all the time. You already believe. I'm not like trying to convince you of something you think like, well, that was strange. I'm sad that that's in the Bible. Like, this is a very normal, there are good rulers and bad rulers. And we do live in a world where, like, I might have to decide to believe things even if they're not popular. Even if Andy's going to think I'm an idiot for believing it, like, well, but I think it's true. We'll live in a world where we have to get along knowing that there is something of home, of the promised land, of the home of God, robbed from us by the violence and cruelty of others. And that doesn't mean God has abandoned us. There are many different details in moving from chapters 8 to 12 to this prediction section, if you're following my notes. There are many details in that make sense of Daniel if, like, oh, it's close to this event when Antiochus came and attacked. It's close to Pompey conquering the Middle East. It's close to the Romans destroying the temple in 70 AD. And none of them are ever quite. And I do know the same, like TikTok theologians, I have listened to people describe that how, well, because the numbers in Daniel, the numbers of years and the exact processes of things that happen don't line up, and that's a sign that it's all BS. Like, actually, the way this is written and the way that predictions work in the Bible, the way that prophecy works in the Bible, suggests that Daniel wasn't talking about a single moment of returning from the promised land, of having to rebuild after you've been dragged down into exile. Daniel's talking about all of those moments where we deal with corrupt worldly powers, where we deal with situations where we don't actually have all the autonomy to control what we're doing. It isn't a prediction, it's prophecy. It doesn't have to do with just this one moment in time. This is how God sees human attempts to create order through violence. And humans who are unwilling to find humility or repentance are animals. I mean, that's what, like, my dog, Eleanor, Chase came because I had to go to the Hope Center meeting today, and Max still has a fever, so Chase came to my house to watch him. She let Eleanor Roosevelt out, and she just booked it. She ran down the street. I spent 45 minutes chasing after this dog, which was not what I wanted to do with the 45 minutes of childcare that I had purchased. But, like, she doesn't have any control over herself. But you do, because you are not a beast. You can lead a moral life. Now, I already gave away the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man bit. But, like, Daniel's where this phrase comes from. And it's very clear in his dream that someone, a new Messiah, a human figure, will be able to rule in such a way that he takes up this empty throne that's left over from the Garden of Eden. And so, just like the briefest of recaps, Jesus strolls into Jerusalem and keeps referring to himself as the Son of Man. There's not one person who'd heard him speak that had not read this story did not know. And the problem with worshiping idols, the reason why all of these, like, things are structured around, who didn't eat the meat, who didn't worship Nebuchadnezzar, why is idolatry the thing that people, why is that the big takeaway from this thing that's all about violence? It's because idolatry is how you order your life. Worship is literally, it's so easy in English. It's literally worthship. You can look me up in an etymology dictionary. You worship something by saying, like, oh, this has ultimate worth. I'm going to give up other things in order to make sure that this happens. I'm going to give up other things in order to make sure that this is true. I'm going to not believe stuff I believe about God because I worship Nebuchadnezzar. I do not believe God is this weird, austere, nitpicky, rule-following or else kind of God. I don't think that the people who wrote the Bible believed that. I think they're always talking about how you orient and shape your life, how you make decisions. And I get in trouble with my colleagues because I am more biblical literalist than many Episcopal priests are. I'm like, oh yeah, it said it in the Bible, so we should talk like that happens, or like that happened. But I also believe that people tell stories the way they tell them for a purpose. So I probably think some of these things happened more literally than many of you do, but I don't think that they're in this book because they happened. I think they're in this book and told this way because of the message that they communicate about how we're supposed to live. Lots of things happened we didn't write down. I'm only 9 minutes behind. Daniel questions, comments. Somebody's got to come up with something. I've done way too much talking.
Well, we're still trying to erase the Jews.
Not we. Yeah, I was gonna. That's that's not our current project in this room.
I know. I'm not saying we personally, but the world is still trying to erase the Jewish nation.
The whole purpose, the whole way that I framed last year, talking about the 5 books of the Torah, was Christians are a huge part of that. Anti-Semitism is a problem in Christianity and has been, and I just don't, I think I mean this literally, I can't imagine anything the devil enjoys more than Christians who are anti-Semitic, right? Like, oh, you supposedly worship the Jesus, and he was Jewish, but you hate Jewish people? Like that doesn't make any sense. It's very confusing intellectually. It's very confusing spiritually. Luke is the person who writes the word Jews the most in the gospel. So in his gospel, it keeps saying the Jews said this, the Jews said that. Everybody Luke was writing to was Jewish. Luke was Jewish. If I wrote a story about what happened in my day this week, and I said like, oh, well, and the Virginians did this, all of y'all would know. I mean, like, I'm indicted in the conversation. If we forget that, then you have an excuse to like go murder Jewish people, God's chosen people. That was not a question, but I treated it like one and offered an answer anyway. Did I say anything about Daniel that y'all are like, well, that's not what was in the VeggieTale? Okay. Then I can do Ezekiel faster because I have to, because of the rules I gave myself. Part of the reason that I do literary shape is that Hebrew scriptures written over about a 1,500-year period genuinely use the physical shape of their stories to tell part of the story. I mean, like you read Esther is shaped. If you like do the chapters and like just bullet points what happens in the chapter, and you use words and like you have a thesaurus out, you can see it's a menorah. And then you get to the end of the story of Esther, and like that's the menorah is what they use to celebrate Esther because that's the shape of the story. Like the two things are connected. It's not like, well, we had this weird shaped candle. It's like, no. We told the story of Esther because of this Purim, like this festival, this way. The shape of these stories actually tells us something about what the people are trying to communicate. And Ezekiel is also living exiled in Babylon. And the beginning of his story is just accusations about why. Why did this happen? It's his 30th birthday. He should be becoming a priest this year. He's down in the sewage ditches, watching the water flow out of the city. So, like, that should bring to mind a kind of olfactory experience. He's not sitting by a lovely river. There's some waste products from a time before there was sewage lines coming out of this river. He's off in exile. He is one of the priestly caste. He would not be a king like Daniel might have been. He should be in religious authority and cannot be because he didn't receive the training because he got carted off into exile. He's this nobody down in the ditch, smelling like human waste, and he encounters the glory of God in this vision. And it's scandalous because God's on this throne, and the throne is on a pedestal, and the pedestal is held by four creatures that have wings that are touching each other, and each of the creatures have four faces, and they're standing on these wheels, and like, it doesn't make sense. Maybe it makes sense to God. It's the same components of the Ark of the Covenant described in a different orientation, in a different order. So it's not like the Ark got up and left. But whatever the Ark is meant to represent is there floating over this Babylonian city having left. And the question arises like, why would God abandon Jerusalem? chapters 1 through 11 are like, here's all those reasons. There's horrible stuff going on. There's the I'm not going to remember that deity's name either. There's a statue like next to the pit where they make offerings to Yahweh. And there's a statue of one of the Babylonian gods that's there. And they're worshiping that in addition to Yahweh, like hoping that the siege of Jerusalem will end by like appealing to the other god. Or like the orientation of your life piece. I mean, like if the imaginary Hindu country comes and attacks the city of Petersburg, and we like all started reading the Bhagavad Gita. Thank you. We all started reading the Bhagavad Gita, like just in case, just hedge our bets. Like it's very strange behavior. People treat each other poorly. The richest people in the country treat the poorest people horribly, even though there are laws that are supposed to protect them. The people in the temple are ignoring their priestly duties. The people who are supposed to be in leadership are like selling themselves out to Egypt and to Tyre, trying to save themselves from the Babylonians. It's not going to work. And so all of the reasons that Jerusalem should fall are laid out in these first 11 chapters. And then in the next, whatever, chapter through 24 is God's judgment against. It's like, because you've been like this, I'm coming. And there are consequences to your actions, and they're bad consequences. And in chapters 14 and 18 and 20, so like interspersed in what God's going to do to judge, to punish Israel, are these poems where Ezekiel's saying, acting like a prosecutor, saying like, this actually has to happen. Here's how bad our behavior has been as a society. And in order for God to be just, we can't just be over it. Like, we have reached an event horizon where you cannot behave. So it's like Pharaoh. You read through Pharaoh in Exodus. Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then Pharaoh hardens his heart. And then the fourth time, I think it's, and then Pharaoh's heart was hardened, which no one is accused there. It just sort of happens. But the last time, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. It's like, there will come a point where you've participated in so much evil that you can't just turn around. Like, you're actually going to have to see it through. And that doesn't mean there's no redemption for some people. That just means like the redemption that is imaginable for those people is totally beyond the scope of what you and I have to deal with practically. So when like Pope Francis says, well, I hope that hell is empty, which is a perfectly reasonable thing for a Catholic to say. I mean, like, some American news sources were like, this is scandalous. It's like, well, I think their catechism says you're supposed to pray for hell to be empty. It's a very normal thing for a pope to say, but he means like, yeah, there are some people who are so evil they wound up in hell, and maybe God's got a plan for them. Some kind of system. I don't know what the system is, but I'm going to pray that something takes place. We don't worship a God with linear time. It doesn't have to be like, over the next 80 years. Like, I don't know what a timeless God experiences things like. I don't know what the afterlife is time-wise. There is an event horizon, and you can believe in that level at which evil has become so much it is unforgivable, and still believe people can be redeemed. Ezekiel certainly does. It's like calling on people to turn around while also saying it is too late. Like, turn around, yes, but also Babylon's coming. The next section is the judgment against the neighbors. The neighbors are important. I should have brought the map down here, but I didn't want props today. I'll make sure there is a map next week. The Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites are all cousins. Ammon, Moab, Edom. I don't actually remember where the Philistines come from off the top of my head, but they're like other non-Jacob Abrahamic families. They're all like Ammon is the son of Lot, who is Abraham's cousin. So you like look at these judgments against the nations, because everybody's, I mean, Ezekiel's just made the point ad nauseum, like y'all have behaved so badly, we're all in trouble. And then he comes and says, like, but so does everybody else. None of humanity is going the way that it's supposed to if we're going to be in that garden. And cycling through these people and their names is like, those are people who are close to us, they're cousins, related, tribally speak the same language, and they're people as far off as Egypt, as the people north in Tyre on the coast. Israel has like allied with these nations, but some of them, they're kin. And they're going to face judgment just like everybody. Because it's not like, I mean, from the perspective of the writer of Ezekiel, it's not like, well, they got it right and you were close, but now they're the favorites. Even the cousins, not the favorites. At the end of this, in chapter 23 or 33, is when Ezekiel learns that like Jerusalem has fallen, and this has come to pass. Like everything that he said would happen has finally happened. And again, that is a little prediction-y. That's prediction adjacent. Except it had already happened when the story was written. So it couldn't possibly be that we are supposed to believe that this is a story just about how Ezekiel knew something and then it happened, got you. The next pieces are, I think, what we're supposed to take from the story. It's a whole section about there's hope for Israel. And so much of the things y'all know, but maybe don't know where, maybe you're better Bible students than I am. Maybe you don't always remember where they come from. Like this is one of the first places that a Messiah figure is used. This is one of the first places that the Son of Man phrase is going to be used. This is the, am I saying this right? Yeah, New David. This is also the Valley of Dry Bones. It's like, hey, yeah, judgment has come. Jerusalem has fallen. We were worried about all these things, but like God can bring new life and intends to. Then chapters 38 through 39 is like, and that new life isn't just for us. It's for those neighbors. It's for those people under the thumb of evil kings and large armies. It's for all of the people around us, and out further, chapters 40 through 48, there's actually hope for everything. Part of the reason to talk about Daniel and Ezekiel next to each other is the symbolism for the entirety of Revelation can be found here. I mean, Revelation's got the like lamb at the center where there should be an altar, and out of the lamb flows the river of living waters. And like that's a confusing statement if you're just reading it by itself, except that in Ezekiel, there's the new temple and the new Jerusalem, and there's supposed to be an altar, but out of the altar is flowing a river of living waters, and it pours down out over the steps of the temple and down out into the mountains and over down in the valley and like brings new life to the area around the Dead Sea. Creation is spreading from what happens at the temple. God's presence returns in such a way that it impacts the whole, it's a domino for the whole world, which is incidentally what Christians believe about the presence of God, that it is here to change the whole world. These No, I can skip the purpose of covenant relationships because I already talked about that because I'm not very good at following my notes. No, actually, the point of studying these guys is like partially because Jesus talks about them and uses images that they used. So if we're going to take seriously like whether or not we believe in what Jesus is doing, it behooves us to like know what he said. Partially, this idea of covenant relationship is not ever about saving you personally. It also is. People are individuals. I mean, I'm not gonna gloss over this. There's nothing else to talk about in the like 800 chapters of Isaiah. Isaiah appears before the throne of God and immediately says, like, I'm unworthy to be here. I'm a man of unclean lips and I come from an unclean people. The people who wrote the Bible can't separate out the individual from the community. How you are, if it's healthy, if it's, I don't know, stealing from the bank. Like, I don't know, if you're like cheating on your taxes, if you're like in and out of jail, if you're like hungry and nobody's paying any attention and making sure you get fed. Like all of those things affect all of us. Judgment isn't one thing and like, oh, you got all the right check boxes and so like you're saved and screw you. At least scripture does not present it like that. Many Episcopalians, many Anglicans worldwide believe that there are people who like ultimately wind up rejecting God forever. And whether you think about that as hell, whether you think about it as annihilation, whether you have a C.S. Lewis kind of idea where like the gates of hell are open and they're just looking at those gates like, I'm not going. Whatever your vision of that is, it's a really reasonable thing in this tradition to believe that God doesn't ultimately force everyone to be saved. But it is an unreasonable and not very Anglican thing to believe that, like, well, your life doesn't have to do with mine because I'm saved, so I don't have to care about you anymore. Like, actually, if I got saved, now I got to start really taking seriously what the needs of the people around me are. Because that's what the covenant is. The covenant is not for Israel so that you can be the special people and everybody else is SOL. The covenant is always presented as so Israel can lead people in the rest of the world to living a better life. And that's what the first thing God says to Abraham is like, hey, this will be for everybody. I'm going to do it through you, but it's going to be for everybody. I'm going to go over by 1 minute. Because I did on my list of things that Jesus like, hey, I'm making some points here. You're going to have to wrestle with these points. Ezekiel sees the presence of God leave over to the east, as in passes over the Mount of Olives, and sees that the new Jerusalem, the new temple, will return from the east. And there's no way Jesus didn't know that. When he's like marching into town and he makes sure he comes from Bethany, where he has to pass down the Mount of Olives and come into the city from the east. It would be very bad Jewishness, a thing which Jesus was notoriously very good at, to know that from the east of Jerusalem means over the Mount of Olives. And then he knows he's about to be captured and he's about to be killed and he couldn't flee the city, but he doesn't. He sort of leaves the city, but he goes to a place where they could definitely find him, at the Garden of Gethsemane, at the foot of the Mount of Olives. So even the soldiers who work for the temple, who are good Jewish boys and absolutely know that the presence of God returns from the Mount of Olives, gotta drag him back. There's no way he doesn't know that. Jesus is cheeky. We should think it's cool. I'm going to end with this thought, because I ask myself this thought all the time. Or I get asked this more often than I wonder about it. I didn't need to say that sentence at all. It's like, why don't these guys just say what they mean? And I've come to believe, studying the Old Testament, they actually do. And it's not their problem that we aren't familiar with the symbols. It might be our problem, because it's not like this book isn't free. You could get one in any hotel room. You can just read the book and figure out the symbols. If you're watching Age of Ultron, you know that Thor's got this hammer Mjolnir that only he's worthy to pick up, because he's the hero. He's the guardian of Asgard. And all the guys are drinking, and they start trying to move Thor's hammer. And Thor has this weird moment because, Captain America moves it a little bit, but can't quite lift it up. And him moving it a little bit, Thor's like, oh, maybe Cap's got something going on. But he can't move the hammer. By the end of Avengers Endgame, Cap just summons that hammer by and it flies into his hand, because he is the hero now. He's grown. He's sacrificing himself to save humanity, whatever he's doing at that moment. Nobody is asking the same question of Marvel. Nobody's like, why don't these Marvel people just say what they mean? If you're familiar with the symbols, then it is really very clear. And it's not the Bible's fault that we're not very familiar with the Old Testament symbols. I don't mean you have to be, but it's a weird complaint oh, this archaic stuff doesn't make any sense. It's well, I don't know how long did you try to figure out what made sense about it? Because I really bet you believe a lot of the stuff that Daniel and Ezekiel believe about power, about violence, about the ways in which people can be good or not. And especially about when you've been so not that there will be consequences, whatever you do next. I bet all y'all believe most of it. It'd shock me if somebody took that seriously and was like, nope, there are no consequences. We live in a universe where everything I do is fine. It'd be a weird thing for you to tell your priest. I mean, you shouldn't do it. We'll schedule a meeting. You don't have to do it in front of people. We should take a break, and everybody who wants to should leave, and then I'm going to ask if y'all have questions, things you want to talk about. We should help clean up and do some dishes.
Finish the punch.
Finish the punch. Circle back. It's 8:04 now. At 8:10, I'll talk if anybody still wants to. And if nobody does, I'll go home. Tell Mary Margaret that y'all had a bunch of questions. Online people, this next 5 minutes will be very boring. I am sorry about it. No, it just looked like that at that moment. I think this is fun. I believe you would tell me. Adventure.
That's what I
am. Harrison, it's good to see you, sir. I love your glasses.
Thank you.
I have a pair of sunglasses. They do not fit my body. They're not my aesthetic at all. Okay. Trying to get out of doing dishes, that's what it is.
You know I wasn't gonna be able to stay to do dishes anyways with 4 children. I gotta go home and probably do a whole thing full anyway.
If nobody has any questions. Start rambling. Works because we do this way. If every time somebody came to the church, they would get lecture, I think they'd stop coming. But once a year for 5 weeks, it seems to
be all right.
It's
Yeah.
Well, next week, we're all. Actually, online friends, nobody looks poised to ask me questions, so I'm going to turn off this feed. If you have questions, email me. Let me know. I'll answer. And I'll send you these notes so you can know what